Have you ever stopped to think about what actually holds the internet together? It's not always the flashy websites or the apps you use every day. So often, it's the invisible technologies, the ones working tirelessly behind the scenes. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on one of these unsung heroes, a database called MySQL. All right, let's get into it.
And this right here, this quote is the key to the whole story. We're not just talking about a tool for developers. No. This is about a fundamental building block of our digital world. Think of it like the concrete and steel in a skyscraper. The story of MySQL is, in a lot of ways, the story of how the modern web got built.
So here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll look at how MySQL became this quiet workhorse for the web. Then, we'll see how it powered a massive revolution in publishing and helped scale a little thing called a social network. We're also going to get into the tough moments, when things went wrong, and finally, explore how those very failures created a legacy that's stronger than ever.
Okay, so our story kicks off in the early days of the web, when everything was still new and growing like crazy. While all the big tech companies were grabbing headlines, MySQL, this open-source database, was quietly getting adopted, well, everywhere. Why? It was powerful, it was reliable, and the best part? It was free. That made it the absolute go-to for countless startups and developers trying to build the next big thing online.
And this brings us to our first major example of its impact, where MySQL went from being just a technical tool to something that shaped culture itself. And it all revolves around its connection to a platform you've probably heard of, WordPress.
The decision they made was so simple, but it was absolutely transformative. WordPress just bundled MySQL as its default database. Now think about that. For a whole world of creators, bloggers, and small businesses who couldn't afford those pricey software licenses, getting a powerful, free database was everything. This one move put industrial-strength technology into the hands of millions of regular people, basically handing them the keys to build their own corner of the web. It was a total game-changer.
And here you can see the result. MySQL became the silent engine behind what we now call the blogging revolution. Suddenly, anyone with an idea and an internet connection could have a global voice. It fueled this massive cultural shift, completely democratizing publishing and changing the media landscape for good. And it all happened thanks to this little database, just humming away in the background.
So we've gone from empowering millions of individuals to an even bigger, crazier challenge, connecting the entire world on a single platform. This, of course, brings us to Facebook, which faced a scaling problem unlike anything anyone had ever seen before.
Honestly, this was the ultimate stress test. Before Facebook, the common wisdom was that you needed an expensive proprietary database to handle that kind of massive traffic. But Facebook's engineers, they bet on MySQL. And by doing that, they pushed the technology to its absolute breaking point, proving to the entire world that open-source software could in fact run the planet.
So how in the world did they pull it off? Well, they got really creative. They used a technique called replication, which is kind of like creating a bunch of identical, perfectly synchronized copies of the database. So when you posted something, that data would get copied to servers all over the world, spreading out the work so nothing got overloaded. It was this kind of flexibility that made MySQL perfect for them. It let them build a totally custom system designed to handle the constant flood of billions of likes, comments, and posts every single day.
But with all this success and this insane growth came enormous pressure. MySQL wasn't just for blogs anymore. It was now critical infrastructure for global commerce and communication. And sometimes, that engine stalled.
And that question, it really gets to the heart of the problem, doesn't it? When you become that essential, any little failure can have these massive ripple effects. A small bug isn't just a bug anymore. It's a potential global outage. The stakes got unbelievably high. And yeah, outages happened. For e-commerce sites, it was a catastrophe. A database failure meant no new orders, no payments, no way to manage inventory. These weren't just technical glitches. They were massive business-critical failures that showed just how vulnerable you could be when you rely so heavily on one piece of tech.
So what was actually breaking? Well, a common one was something called replication lag. Remember those synchronized copies we talked about? Lag is when those copies just can't keep up, so a user in one place might see old, outdated information. Another big one was schema missteps, which is just a fancy way of saying there was a mistake in the database's blueprint. One small error in that blueprint could bring the whole system crashing down. The very success of these platforms was creating scaling problems nobody had ever imagined before.
But here's where the story takes a really interesting turn. These failures, they weren't the end. In fact, they became the foundation for a much stronger, more resilient web. The entire industry learned from every single one of these painful mistakes.
You see this cycle with almost all major technologies. First, everyone rushes to adopt it. Then, it breaks under the pressure, revealing all its weaknesses. That forces everyone to learn a lesson, to focus on things like resilience and good governance. And what comes out of that is the legacy, a much stronger, more reliable infrastructure for everyone. That's exactly what happened with MySQL.
And these are the big takeaways from that whole era. The industry learned, the hard way, that building systems that can handle failure isn't just a nice-to-have, it's essential. That having strict rules and processes in place, what we call governance, is what stops a simple mistake from becoming a disaster. And most importantly, that user trust is built on one thing, a service that is reliable and just works.
And so we come full circle. Through its massive successes with WordPress and Facebook, and through its incredibly painful public failures, MySQL proved this statement beyond a shadow of a doubt. It cemented its place not just as software, but as a core piece of the Internet's infrastructure. You know, the story of MySQL is such a powerful lesson about the technologies we all rely on. And it makes you wonder, what are the invisible systems being built right now? The ones quietly powering the next revolution? And what lessons are we going to learn when they, too, inevitably start to stall under the pressure of their own success?